recording. And the recording is now. There should be a transcription visible to everyone as well. Defenseless villages are bombarded from the air, the inhabitants driven out into the countryside, the cattle machine gunned, the huts set on fire with incendiary bullets. This is called pacification. Millions of peasants are robbed of their farms and sent trudging along the roads with no more than they can carry. This is called transfer of population or rectification of frontiers. People are imprisoned for years without trial or shot in the back of the neck or sent to die of scurvy in Arctic lumber camps. This is called elimination of unreliable elements. Such phraseology is needed if one wants to name things without calling up mental pictures of them. George Orwell, Politics and the English Language, 1946. I'd actually hoped that you would be able to see Orwell's words and some of the other words that we want to share with you today. You will be able to see them in the Words About War Matter language guide. We'll put the link to the language guide in the chat as well as the file itself momentarily. Want to thank you again for joining us. Again, if you're just joining, just to make you aware that we are recording this event. The language guide, the Words About War language guide, is the product of months of work by dozens of people, and I'm thrilled to finally share it with you, and we are thrilled to share it with you. From George Orwell's critique of the language of totalitarian regimes to today, discussions of war and foreign policy have been full of dehumanizing euphemisms, bloodless jargon, little-known government acronyms, and troubling metaphors that hide warfare's damage. Think of collateral damage. What's that mean? Civilian deaths. Overseas contingency operations, that is wars. Bug splat, killing human beings with drone-fired missiles. 22 years ago this September, just days after the 9/11 attacks, President George W. Bush first used the phrase war on terror to justify wars and violence that would cross the globe and span decades to today's Biden administration. Enhanced interrogation would become an infamous euphemism for the torture that CIA and military operatives inflicted on human beings from Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib to CIA black sites globally. Words About War Matter, the language guide, aims to change how people talk about and discuss war. Our goal is to help people write and talk about war and war-driven foreign policies more accurately, more honestly, and in ways that clearly expose the harms of war. I want to introduce you to three of the great people who are among the dozens who helped play key roles in the collaboration that produced the Words About War Matter language guide. Teresa Issa Arreola, Eli Clifton, and Maha Hilal. It's much more fun to have them introduce themselves. You'll hear, and maybe have already heard enough from me. So let me turn to Maha Hilal to introduce yourself briefly.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, David, for hosting this event. My name is Dr. Maha Hilal. I am the Executive Director of Muslim Counter Publics Lab and the author of the book, Innocent Until Proven Muslim Islamophobia, the War on Terror, and the Muslim Experience Since 9/11.
Eli.
Thank you, David, and thank you, David, for all your hard work in organizing us around this. I'm Eli Clifton. I'm a senior advisor at the Quincy Institute, and I spend a lot of my time as an investigative journalist. My beat is reporting on the intersection of money and politics and U.S. foreign policy.
Anissa.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. And thank you, David, as well. I want to echo a great amount of thanks to you for keeping this going and helping us throughout this process. My name is Isa Ariola, and I'm an assistant professor at Concordia University. I'm a cultural anthropologist by training. I also chair a demilitarization advocacy group in the Northern Mariana Islands called Our Commonwealth 670.
Thank you, Isa. So just to provide a quick overview of what we're going to do, we want to introduce you to the guide. Again, momentarily, you'll see it in the chat, as well as a link to the website that hosts the guide, which we want to repeat it over and over again because we want you to use this guide, to share it with others. You can find it and you'll be able to find it. Others will be able to find it at www.wordsaboutwar.org. www.wordsaboutwar.org. Should say the website's under development and will add additional resources and information as time goes on. But again, we want to encourage everyone possible to use the guide. We think the guide will be especially useful to help journalists and other writers, podcasters, vloggers, students, teachers, policy analysts, people involved in public education involved in public education projects, members of Congress, people on Capitol Hill, ordinary folks of all stripes and far, far beyond. Let me just let first Maha and then Eli just say a few quick words about why we see this as such an important contribution.
Well, I mean, we know when we study war and we look at war, the catastrophic events of the war on terror, that language has played a huge role in justifying state violence against Muslim communities and against other communities. So that's why it's so important to shift and push back against this language so we can really target and challenge state violence.
Thank you, Maha. I would just add that, you know, as a journalist and somebody who's sort of been watching the political trends, I think it's really interesting that really in the past several years, there's been, you know, maybe the withdrawal from Afghanistan, but it probably predates that, increasingly a political discussion about how did these wars happen? How did we end up committing these human rights abuses and the waste of public resources that went into it? And I think this is an opportune moment for a guide that simply is trying to present how to accurately talk about war and the mechanisms in our government and private sector who help undertake these wars that are increasingly controversial in ways that maybe they hadn't been not so many years ago. So I think it's a crucial moment to start to say, well, is there something in the language that we've been using that has made it sanitized it, maybe helped justify it, or maybe just made it in some cases so boring that people haven't paid attention to it until ideally, at least in the more near term. So those would just be my brief thoughts.
Thanks, Eli. I'm just going to offer a few of the suggestions that the guide provides. Again, if you didn't hear before, apparently Zoom, or my command of Zoom, has somehow escaped me, or the share function on Zoom has escaped us. It seems to have disappeared, perhaps because we're recording, don't know. I'd wanted to share some of the visuals and some of the words on the screen, but I'll do my best to capture the essence of what you would have seen. And what you're seeing in my background is the language guide itself. I'll provide a few examples, then I'll turn things over to Isa, Maha, and Eli for a few other thoughts, and then we'll open things up to conversation and questions. Some people are already posting in the chat. Again, the guide itself is in the chat, as well as the website, www.wordsaboutwar.org, wordsaboutwar.org. The guide provides essentially a list of terms to avoid, terms that we think folks should avoid in conversations and discussions of war and foreign policy, then offers better alternatives to words that we think are unhelpful and often dishonest or misleading. And then it offers an explanation of why we think the words are to be avoided and why the alternatives are preferable. Some ways we can encapsulate the major advice provided by the guide in this way. We think that clear, accurate, honest, descriptive language is always the best rule when discussing war and foreign policy. When discussing war in particular, a phenomenon that has such profound, often deadly effects on human flesh and bones, we should use, as retired Air Force officer Bill Astore says, bullet hits the bone words. Bullet hits the bone words that describe war's effects as directly, as clearly, as honestly as possible. One example, we provide drone to drone. It's become a verb. It's used to disguise extrajudicial killing. Avoid this and other dehumanizing language related to drones. Bug splat, I mentioned before, is a clearly dehumanizing term used by some drone operators to describe human beings they have killed. In many contexts, the word defense, and someone referred to this in the chat already, in the name of the agency overseeing the US military, the Department of Defense. Defense has become a misleading Orwellian word used to describe warfare and other military actions that often have little, if anything, to do with defending anyone. Just because someone says something is defense doesn't make it true. In most cases, war, military, or the word Pentagon are better and more accurate terms. Defense spending, the defense industry, the defense budget, these are all some of the many examples, defense contractors. These are terms that assume and take for granted that taxpayer money and the activities of large corporations, described as defense contractors, for example, are providing defense. They hide, of course, the military's offensive functions, the functions that the US military has played throughout US history, for that matter. The AP style book similarly suggests that military spending usually is a more precise term than, for example, defense spending. Another example, military exercises. We hear about them all the time, occurring in the South China Sea, for example. Military exercises makes it sound like we're talking about jumping jacks or push-ups, calisthenics, something benign you might do in a gym. When, of course, the activities involved in military exercises are often, if not always, preparations for war, often designed as literal threats to a nearby country, given that war exercises, a much preferred term, war exercises or war maneuvers can disguise an actual invasion force. I've mentioned a few examples in a US context, but one of the images I wanted to share was a Reuters headline about the Russian so-called defense budget, which Reuters described as rising due to the Russian war in Ukraine. The contradiction of the defense budget and the war in Ukraine in the same headline shows the way in which the suggestions we're offering here, while focused on a US context, are applicable worldwide. The budget that the Russian government is dedicating to the war in Ukraine could hardly be called something we would describe as defense. Let me turn things over now to Isa to offer a few thoughts, and then Eli and Maha will follow. And then again, we'll look forward to taking your questions in the chat. At any point, you can put your questions in the chat, either by chatting directly to me or to everyone in the room. Isa.
Thank you, David. So I just want to briefly discuss the way that we can kind of use the language guide in a community or grassroots setting, particularly among those working to demilitarize their communities and in other activist communities. And I'd be interested to hear others' feedback on this. I mentioned that I'm the chair of our Commonwealth 670. It's situated in Saipan. It also happens to be, I just want to situate myself a bit to help you understand how I relate to the guide and how I see the guide. I'm on the island of Saipan, which is in the Northern Mariana Islands, and the Marianas, and it's also part of a broader archipelago called the Marianas Archipelago, which many of you know right now, like the broader Pacific is in a state of hyper-militarization by the United States, so contemporary hyper-militarization that's being accompanied by a major increase in the US presence in the form of embassies, funding, and lo and behold, more bases. So in this context, this is kind of the context in which I'm coming from. And in this context, we're seeing how a guide like this really is exposing some of the similarities and the terms being used in militarized communities throughout the Pacific, but also globally. And I really see this as critical to building a kind of broader movement built on solidarities that are rooted in those common experiences, often being on the kind of receiving end of this language. And so this allows us to respond from a community level in a way to kind of resist military planning from a place of knowledge and awareness rather than isolation, this feeling of isolation, or this sense of being overwhelmed by the technicality and perhaps even in seemingly, I guess, inarguability of the terms, of the military terms. So from a decolonial perspective, activists, of course, many of you know this that are here with us today, and community members are reframing militarized language to shift narratives around war all the time. And are working to denaturalize the language, and not just the language, but really the grammar, right, that is organizing around violence. And so one example of this violent framing that we're seeing in the Pacific, especially in the media, is around our islands being framed as sites for future war. We are literally being asked, right, to shoulder the burden of a future war between the United States and China. And so as if, because of our geographic location, we are somehow predestined for war. And so how does this perspective come about, right? Well, in part, because there's this very well-established military grammar built around framing islands and other locations, again, this is not unique, as essential to, quote, national security. Perhaps, and I'd also be very interested to hear everyone's take on this, but perhaps the most pervasive term to justify further militarization in this context is the term strategic, which if you're looking at the kind of military definition of what strategic is, right, it means as part of a military plan. But the term has come to be imbued with such a strong sense of importance, almost self-importance, by the military and militarized communities for that matter. And we've really come to almost associated terms like that with being special, being unique. And as you can see from this guide, there's a global kind of underlying logic, unity to these terms. So we are indeed not unique in this system. So in a place-based community context, one way to turn the defense or security logic on its head is really to challenge this inevitability of war and really rephrase military terminology in a way that allows the public to digest these really complex plans in ways that are truer to reality and speak to the human and other than human costs of war and militarization. So I just want to give one really quick example in the Marianas. So I'm currently sitting on the island of Saipan, which is in the middle of what the Pentagon calls the Mariana Islands Training and Testing Study Area. This very long technical term that most people aren't even aware of, even if you're quite literally sitting in it. And so one of the ways that activists have kind of reframed that terminology, even though this is still a militarized term, is they just straight up call it the Marianas Bombing Range. So among other things, this rephrasing, like what you're seeing with this guide, is an attempt to bring a sense of kind of clarity to a really complicated set of plans that are filled with jargon, and essentially are incomprehensible to a non-specialist. At least that's how the plans are communicated here by the Pentagon, but also to reclaim a sense of reality over the space that we live in, and really challenge the language which is simply not meant to be challenged. And I think that's part of why we're here, is like, we want to denaturalize this language that is not meant to be discussed, not meant to be challenged, not meant to have any dialogue, right? And so how do we know this? Again, because there's really no room for dialogue in this terminology. So by simply kind of changing the daily use of the terminology, activists can help to really expose this level of vulnerability that we're facing in militarized contexts, and so we can communicate better with one another. So, when we created this guide, there was just like a flurry of names and places and things that came to mind that I thought could go on this list, right? And so all of the different ways that my home islands and other places have been described in the context of militarization came up. And so when you and others here that have joined us today read it, surely there will be other phrases and terms for you to add on and for you to describe in a more accurate and truthful way that really speaks to the true costs of war that we're talking about here. In this way, there is a lot of opportunity, especially in this format, to build dialogue into what these terms have come to mean, rather than simply accepting them as a necessity, inarguable truth, or some sort of singular reality. So in this sense, we really envision the guide as a real start to further discussion that's based on where you are in your time and in your place, right? So to close, we hope that opening up further dialogue about these terms can help us situate the ways we negotiate and reframe militarized terms in our everyday lives, to transform not only the way we talk about war, but also the ways that it's impossible. It is very possible to envision a future without war as well. And I know that we will have other kind of revised versions that will be coming out. And so any of your feedback or any of your participation where you'd like to throw in some terms or have this discussion like we can have today would be so greatly appreciated. We all know so many of you are doing that great work already. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Isa. And indeed, the website www.wordsaboutwar.org has a feedback mechanism where people can suggest additional terms, words, language that we will consider adding in future revisions, revised editions of the guide. Let me turn things over to Eli now.
Thank you. Well, I mean, speaking from the perspective of a journalist, journalists don't often have a lot of time to reflect on language or on the meaning of the words necessarily, but and I think this is really important. All journalists, to the best of my knowledge, are under a great deal of scrutiny and pressure from editors to be concise and to be accurate. And I think this is something that actually this guide does a great job of trying to provide language which ticks both of those boxes, as it were. Now, ironically, the acceptance of DoD and militarist language, it often runs really explicitly against the desire to be concise and accurate. It's very often bureaucratic speak, it's filled with acronyms, and it's often doublespeak. And regardless of the initial intention of why this language came into being and how it was, cooked up in some bureaucracy, the outcome is that it is boring, it's confusing, and it conceals the material that the reporters are reporting on. And that isn't good for journalism, and it's not good for the public discourse. And as I mentioned before, it commits the worst offense of bad journalism, which is probably not what all of you are thinking of, but it's boring. Journalism is in a market of ideas, and it's in a market of ideas that operates by the second, about whether somebody's going to keep reading what you're writing or whether they are going to move on to something that's more engaging. And I think the language which is frequently used to describe war and conflict and the mechanisms behind it would make people want to not even absorb that information, not continue reading the stories and see where it goes, but it makes them want to go read something else. And a few of those examples that I would point to that we address in the guide, one of them is kinetic. Great, you identified, equality in physics. That doesn't really grab anybody. Nobody's interested in that. What is it really? It means the use of bombs, missiles, military violence, things that you actually can describe, things that don't require a lot of words. Some of these can be replaced with just one other word to say what it is that happened. Collateral damage is another one. What does that really mean? It means civilians were killed, they were murdered, or there were deaths. This is explicit language. It tells you what happened. Nobody in their right mind could say that's actually not what occurred. Collateral damage is the accurate description. It's important to just say, hey, here's what happened. And once again, these are action words. These tell people that there was an act of violence. This is something that people will keep reading in my assessment. And I think a lot of editors would embrace that as well, because it's interesting. Love it or hate it, be repulsed by it or drawn to it. It is actions and it is interesting. Targeted killing, another one. It was an assassination or a murder in most cases. Targeted killing, again, is this sort of bureaucratic speak that, maybe on some form in triplicate, that's what they choose to use, and why that might be, I don't want to guess at, but it doesn't make for good language when you're speaking to a general audience who are trying to decide if they're going to keep reading that story or move over to the sports pages where they actually use language to describe what happened in a football game. Defense contractors, those are weapons companies. Maybe they are Pentagon contractors if they are really not making weapons. But once again, defense contractors, this is so broad. The Defense Department is gigantic. They have contractors to do a host of different things. Is it so difficult to identify what type of contractor was involved and what service or good they were providing in exchange for monies that came from taxpayer dollars? Boots on the ground. It's a euphemism. Maybe it evokes some imagery for some people, and for a lot of other people, those are 4 words that don't mean a lot. And it can be reduced down into 1 word in many cases. It was soldiers, it was troops, it was the military, they were Marines, they were people in the Air Force. These are things that can be described with fewer words and making them more accurate, and no one could really contest the accuracy of what's being said instead. You're not taking great liberties here to use these sorts of languages. Finally, lethal aid. Once again, 2 words, it can be taken down to 1, which are weapons. It shouldn't be that difficult to use these words. It shortens the word count. They are action words. They actually mean something to a broad group of people, not just those in a bureaucracy. And I think that they would help bring to light what is going on often in all of our names in the wars around the world that the United States has been waging. So purely from, again, a very reductionist standpoint here, but from a journalist standpoint of let's be concise and let's make it interesting and let's be accurate, we can do a lot better without, again, we're not taking enormous liberties here in doing so. And I think the guide does a good job of trying to provide useful alternatives that may be helpful in future journalistic endeavors to describe these types of events.
Thank you so much, Eli. We're going to turn things over to Mahahalal, and then we're going to open things up to your questions and comments. We're getting many in the chat already, so please feel free again to offer questions or comments in the chat, either to everyone or directly to me.
Well, thank you again, David, for all your work on this guide and for keeping this group together. So I want to just talk a little bit about sort of the larger context, because this guide is a very technical guide, right? We're talking about specific terms, specific phrases, specific words that we want to change, right? And we want to change them to alter the landscape of how we talk about war. So while there are suggestions about individual changes, to me, it's very important also to keep the larger context in mind. So for example, when we think about the wars that were launched post 9/11 and the national security apparatus, there's an entire narrative infrastructure that has bolstered and justified the violence that has been inflicted on different communities. And when we want to tell that complete story, these are some of the ways, using these terms, these words, these phrases, that we can get at the history and accuracy and totality of the violence. So when I'm looking at this guide, I think it's really important not just to adopt some of the more technical pieces, but to really engage in discussions with your colleagues, right? Because again, we're trying to tell a story about war. And that story is not going to be imparted alone if we just shift the terms without much context or explanation around it. And we know what the war on terror's language has looked like. I know war on terror is a term that is used in the language guide as a term you should avoid. I do use the term for specific reasons, and we can talk about that later. But that is to say that, again, this is a point of discussion, right? What will get us closer to, what will get Americans closer to understanding the truth about what this country has done in the name of, quote, fighting terrorism. So specific terms like collateral damage, right? We're all familiar with that. It disguises the deaths, the killings, right? Often, even if we say deaths, right, that obscures why these people died, right? And they died because they were killed. And not only does the use of collateral damage obscure that fact, it also hides the fact that the United States isn't even trying to count the number of people that it has killed, that there are no mechanisms in place to do that. So it's really important, right, to use different terms because of the level of dehumanization that has been embedded in this infrastructure, again, in order to justify and perpetuate violence. When we talk about neutralize, that's an extremely euphemistic word, right? And what does it convey? And who are these terms used on, right? We have to remember that they're not used on everyone, right? They're used on groups and communities whose lives have been rendered meaningless and without value. No one talks about neutralizing Americans, and if another country did, they would be held to pay. So it's about changing these terms and also understanding what groups in particular have been especially dehumanized by the use of these terms. When you talk about precision strikes, it's as if the United States actually cares how much, quote, collateral damage there is. But why should it when there's no consequences? But in using that term, it makes it seem as though the United States operates with an abundance of caution, which we know it does not. If it did, we wouldn't have nearly as many civilian deaths as we know there has been. So really getting rid of a lot of the ways, right, that war is being euphemized. Enhanced interrogation. Obviously, that specific phrase was used to accommodate for the fact that under the Bush administration, the definition of torture was completely redefined. And that is to say that in order for something to have been considered torture, it had to rise to the level of organ failure or death. That's a high threshold. But if you call it enhanced interrogation, everything below that, then it doesn't seem as bad. And we have to remember again that in this particular post 9/11 context, those subjected to this enhanced interrogation, which we know is torture, have been Muslims. Had it been another group, for example, white Christian men, it would most certainly be called torture. And then finally, terrorism. I think probably most of us in this group, in this audience, are aligned on the fact that this has become a relatively useless term. And has become a term that is especially weaponized by the state to justify its violence. Even calling responses counterterrorism, it defines what it's fighting as terrorism without question. And what is terrorism? Who has a monopoly on defining the term terrorism? And that is the state, which means that its violence is not subjected to the same level of scrutiny. And again, if we're trying to get at the truth, if we're trying to minimize human suffering, if we're trying to end wars, if we're trying to challenge what, in our context, the United States government is doing to other countries, as well as people domestically, then it matters what we say, right? It matters what narratives we're using and how these narratives have been consistently designed and deployed to justify state violence. So I'm really glad that this guide came together, thanks to the leadership of David, because it offers us, again, not only technical terms and ways to shift the way we talk about war, but also to encourage a robust discussion about how we can reshape the narrative infrastructure altogether so that the government cannot rely on language to justify its violence. And I'll stop at that.
Thank you so much, Maha. Really appreciate your comments. Just going to bring all our panelists into the same focus. And now we would love to hear your questions. We have a number of questions and comments in the chat. Please, again, share your questions by either chatting directly to me or to the group as a whole. I'll read a few of the comments as people gather their questions. Garrett Grady Lovelace says, this is such a powerful and timely language guide with such far-reaching relevance. This point on conflating whole diverse countries into their military operations is crux. The guide says, and Garrett quotes, avoid talking about countries as singular, homogeneous wholes. Turning a country into a single thing is a common practice that obscures the people in that country. This can make it easier to wage war by hiding war's human damage. Continues, but let me, Garrett continues, both are inaccurate, both fuel xenophobia, anti-Asian and anti-Asian sentiment. Speaking of the example of criticizing China or the Chinese, rather than being specific about criticizing the Chinese government or the Xi regime. Bill Story writes, you might call it the Marianas kill zone, referring to some of Issa's comments earlier, since a bombing range will kill, if not humans, it kills nature. Sharon Abreu offers the suggestion that Blue Angels could be renamed loud CO2 emission distributors. Here's a question that perhaps I'll turn to the panelists in a moment. One term I'd like to hear a lot more about in relation to the military is just transition. I'd like to see just transition programs across the US creating 21st century appropriate jobs to ultimately end our country's addiction to fossil fuels and fossil fuel heavy industries like the military and quote unquote defense industry, that is weapons and other Pentagon contracting industries. I'll read a couple comments and maybe see if Eli, Isa, and Maha have reactions to that question. Donald Smith says, unfortunately, journalism is dying due to the internet and seems to be in service of large corporations and perhaps the CIA. Rosie Berman says, the Center for Civilians in Conflict, CIVIC, recently launched a campaign called #NotCollateralDamage, focused on naming and combating the killing of civilians in war. There's for those in the Zoom room, is a link in the chat. Margot writes, think about how language of sports, especially US football, is so prevalent in discussions of war and foreign policy. What about how language also is related to and creates metaphors to obscure reality and promote or serve certain ideological functions? Indeed, we have a suggestion among several other suggestions to avoid all sports metaphors, equally avoid all medical metaphors, both of which are deeply obscuring and problematic, troubling. Let me turn things to Isa, then Eli, then Maha for two questions. The question about the language of just transition and wanting to hear more about that. And then the question I read just now, what about how language also is related to and creates metaphors to obscure reality and promote or serve certain ideological functions? Isa, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, no, I wish just transition was used a lot more as well. I mean, I think one of the things that we're facing here is that, you know, it's the military and militarized language offers such a strong and powerful kind of security blanket, for lack of a better term, to folks, right? And so, you know, we've really had to take a step back and think about what is it we have to offer, right, as an alternative. And so we have to think about, we have to think about the just transition. What do we, this is another, I don't want to use another military phrase, but how do we move towards practices that involve just transition, right? Because people, what happens is we reach basically a wall when the military comes and offers, you know, X amount, comes with all of its funding, all of its money, right? And we don't have a kind of alternative to give. We don't have an alternate system to kind of provide, right? So we've really been looking towards alternate systems, like, for example, practices that really prioritize Indigenous resurgence, right? So it might be something like prioritizing learning a traditional medicine, right? What simple things like that, like plants that are around us, right? How do we give the younger generation the knowledge of how to kind of identify Indigenous plant medicine, right? These are all of the different ways that, you know, we're kind of thinking through and trying to offer these alternatives that are just and sustainable, right? But it's a difficult task, and so that's what it's a term that I do wish we engaged with more, and we struggle to, I think, every day. I'll hand it off before we move to the second question.
Eli, do you want to take on either or both questions? We're getting a bunch more, and we only have about 13 minutes left, so I'm gonna.
I'll jump on the sports metaphor one, which I find to be particularly interesting and problematic. I think an interesting exercise to think about is that the language, I referenced it earlier, that you're competing with somebody going and reading about a football game, for example. And as the question said, well, the language of sports, and especially US football, gets used a lot when speaking about wars and violent military action undertaken by the United States. And one thing I find to be rather interesting in that is that while the sports metaphors definitely go over towards the description of war and military violence, well, a little bit of that seeps into sports journalism. For the most part, sports journalism is pretty accurate about what's going on. And I think that maybe that's not just an accident. I think with sports journalism, they want to be accurate. The readers demand a degree of accuracy, and the journalists and editors who are overseeing it are trying to, well, they know what's expected of them to essentially describe what happened in these games or in these tournaments. And I think that there's something bizarre happening here when we talk about, well, why is this that we get this obscuring language that's used from sports that's then transposed onto military violence? And one can only speculate, but certainly one reason that I could come up with is that it's intentionally obscuring. It's intentionally a little easier to digest, and it's language that doesn't make you feel so uncomfortable because, hey, you scored a touchdown. That's a good thing, right? And you start to put that onto other events that are maybe not so recreational or sports oriented. It takes on a pretty different meaning, but it obscures what's really going on underneath. So I think it sanitizes. I think it's done because it's language that people do relate to and do find to be at least nominally interesting because they follow sports, but it's being used and misused in ways that intentionally conceal what's actually occurring in ways that, if it was applied to sports journalism, might not be considered acceptable.
Thank you, Eli. Maha, do you want to take on either or both questions briefly?
We can move on so we can get to other questions.
Okay.
And I'll suggest a book in the chat on this.
Great. And feel free to work in either. Just wanted to read a couple of comments and then get to some of the terrific questions that are coming in. One audience member points out that even liberal news programs sometimes use the word mercenaries for the Wagner Group, but private military contractors for US parties, that is corporations that fulfill the same function and organizational characteristics as the Wagner Group. They sanitize private military contractors in the US while doing the opposite for the Russian group. Another audience member says, this reminds me of Nick Estes writing on the US military's racist naming culture, in which the US military has purposely distorted indigenous warrior culture for its own ends. And this is a quote from Nick Estes, often enlisting indigenous names and motifs, such as the Lakota helicopter or the Tomahawk cruise missile for imperialist endeavors. And indeed, that might be a room for expansion in a future version of the guide. I'm going to offer 2 or 3 questions and then see if Isa, Eli, and Maha have responses to any or all. Want to get in as many as possible. What are the best steps for changing the language used within our organization? Especially, for example, when security is in our name. But I think even beyond that, what are the best steps for changing the language used within our organization? Another question, what do we know about how this language will change people's opinions to the extent that they will support anti-war efforts? And how do we avoid scaremongering and desensitizing people to discussions about war? What do we know about how this language will change people's opinions? And how also do we avoid scaremongering and desensitizing people to discussions about war? Who would like to take that, either or both of those first? You said you want to start us off?
I'm sorry, I was reading the chat. Can you read the question again?
Sure, and or maybe Eli or Maha wants to jump in. The question about the best steps for changing language used within an organization, and the question about how these language changes may change people's opinions and how we avoid scaremongering and desensitizing people to discussions
All
about.
right. Thanks, David. I was going to say, I mean, I think part of the answer to that is what we feel kind of what's happening here, right? Which is, at least in my mind, right? Which is to listen to people's experiences, right? In these very militarized spaces, what's happening? What are the underlying unities that people are experiencing, right? Where is it different? Where can we kind of learn from each other, right? Also that these things change with time and space. Again, even though like everyone's experience is valid in this sense, but there has to be this willingness to kind of open up the discussion for dialogue, right? Because and I think that's part of the kind of resistance to this language too. Again, it's a language that's not meant to be opened up, it's not meant to be unpacked, right? And so if we can kind of continue to do that in our own ways, in our own places, again, in this very kind of place-based context, but and then kind of come together like we've done here, right, to see where that terminology intersects and where it doesn't, I think is like really critical to I guess not desensitizing, right, so that they're not people are hearing kind of varied responses to this terminology rather than kind of the one term that goes, right? Yeah, I'll hand that off.
Eli or Maha? Yeah, Eli.
Yeah, I'm sure Maha has thoughts on this as well. I would just briefly say, in putting on my journalist hat, that I've never found opposition from editors to using language that is concise and accurate, and I don't think that's sensationalizing it to say, hey, somebody was killed, or somebody was murdered, or that we're talking about weapons here, not just so-called lethal aid. I understand that does evoke more of an emotional response, perhaps, than the bureaucratized language that is all too commonplace. But I would at least argue strenuously that that's not to sensationalize. I mean, I think you could take it to a place where people would feel that is sensationalizing, but I don't think what's in the guide or pushing for other concise, accurate words instead of what's so commonly used is that in any way, shape, or form sensationalizing what's happening. If you don't like what's happening, and this is where it goes back to how will this, I think, impact or could be of use to anti-war movements. If people don't like being told what's actually happening in a totally neutral manner where it's saying, here are just the facts that happened. If you find that offensive, if you find that to be sensational, if you find that to be something that is problematic that it's happening in your name, I think your problems are probably greater than the language that's being used. The problems are that this is the policy and that this is the reality. And if you have issue with that, and if that offends you, maybe you should speak up and try to change the policy itself. Maha.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add, I think a lot of the ways the government and the media tries to get away with this kind of violence is to make it more palatable to American audiences, right? And we're not here to make it palatable. We need to make it uncomfortable, because it's only through discomfort, right, that people are going to actually, potentially want to do something, right? And so I think maybe this is a longer discussion for another day, but to me, there's a little bit of a distinction when we talk about, for example, messaging versus narrative. And I think when we talk about messaging, the idea is to create value aligned sort of language that resonates with people and that's palatable, right? And that's one approach. But I think what we're trying to do here, right, is to get us closer to the truth. And how do we do that if we're not using truthful terms, right? And how do we make Americans care? Americans as an especially apathetic population, right? That it takes a lot to mobilize. How do we actually make them care about the people, the communities, the countries that are being targeted as a result of US violence that is not only harming them, but is harming people domestically within the United States, and that is to use the accurate language so people know what is happening and they don't have to reach too far forward to have that knowledge because it comes to them.
Thank you so much, Maha. I'm again putting the link to www.wordsaboutwar.org in the chat, as well as the file for the language guide, the Words About War Matter language guide. I should also point out there's a 2-page version. Just want to add a few comments to that great question about how we go about changing language use in an organization or in any group we might be a part of, because that is something the guide addresses. And we encourage people to use the language we are suggesting in every context possible, in writing, in speech. It's worth noting that people on the right, Republicans in particular, are very disciplined in their use of language. And that's part of how they've been able to inject terms like, often dishonest terms, like the death tax into popular conversation, or the way in which the pro-life has come to shape debates about abortion. We urge people to use the suggested language in every context possible. Republicans also actually have in some cases have a pizza jar where if you use the wrong language, you have to put a quarter in a pizza jar. Not sure if we suggest that or not, but the key is using language that is accurate, honest, clear, descriptive in every context possible. And when people slip up in the sense of using traditional euphemistic, dishonest language, we encourage people to talk to them about it, to not shame them. That shaming, of course, is rarely useful, but to use language as an opening for a conversation about the language and terminology we use. Sometimes people will face resistance from editors or organizations, and we encourage people to continue trying to use the best, most accurate, most honest language possible. I want to thank a few people before we wrap up. This guide was produced over many months through wonderful collaborative work involving dozens of people and organizations, including Isa Ariola, Bill Astore, Brian Bowman, Tabitha Chow, Eli Clifton, Anila Dalatsai, Peter Fernbach, George Friday, Shahed Qureshi, Mackenzie Hamilton, Maha Halal, Patrick Hiller, Mikel Legendre, Lisa Ling, Kevin Martin, Tiara Naputi, Madison Rose, David Swanson, Jeff Wilson, and organizations including American University, Concordia University, the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research, Justice is Global, Muslim Counterpublics Lab, Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, University of California, Irvine, Win Without War, and World Beyond War, among many others. Special thanks to the War Prevention Initiative of the Jubitz Family Foundation for supporting the guide, and special thanks to the amazing work of the graphic designer for the guide, Paloma Ayala. Again, don't forget, the guide is available at www.wordsaboutwar.org. Please use it, please share it, please bookmark the website, please print it out and put it by your laptop so that you can refer to it when you're writing or speaking. Again, please offer your feedback as well as suggestions for additional language, words, terms that we might add to the guide in the future. And we, above all, want to thank you for being with us today. Thank you to the amazing speakers, Isa, Eli, and Maha. We look forward to continuing the conversation about language and how specifically conversation and changing our language can lead us more effectively to action that actually does something about and changes something about war and foreign policy. Thank you all.